Okay, so in this video I want to talk about grounded theory, this word induction, and this word saturation. And to do that I want to tell a quick story about qualitative research that I was engaged in and that some of my students were engaged in. And the idea was about a quick service restaurant app, or the studies were for a quick service restaurant app, a delivery app, akin to something like an Uber Eats or like the Amazon version of that, or Favor. And we were interviewing restaurants, and we would just go in, we would just walk in, and this is how sort of non-systematic, I would say, or fluid, you might want to say, qualitative research can be. We just went into restaurants during off hours and tried to talk to anybody who would talk to us. We ended up talking to me and my students together ended up talking to over 100 different restaurants. And we wanted to know sort of what were people's perceptions of these quick service restaurant apps, the delivery ones like Uber Eats and Amazon, whatever the Amazon one is called. But there's over 15 of those apps in Austin alone. We wanted to get people's impressions of them. And interviewed over 100 people, and at the end of that, there were really three, when you're talking about the negative things about those apps, there were really only three main categories that emerged. And those were: staff did not like dealing with the phone calls from those apps, number one. There was lots of people saying that. Number two, the drivers, the delivery drivers, say the Uber drivers and the Amazon drivers, they would get tipped proportionally to how much food was delivered, let's say. So if somebody ordered 5 meals, then the delivery driver would get tipped proportionally to that, and the staff at the restaurant didn't get tipped at all. And that gave strong, like, people who were saying that, the staff, had strong emotions about that. They felt it was unfair. And then a lot of times managers and people who were like chef type people, they were frustrated because they had no control over how the food was actually displayed to the end user. They weren't in control of, say, how fresh the food was, because they would give it to the delivery driver and they would take it to the place, and they didn't know if that was going to take 10 minutes or 45 minutes. So, right, that was something that was common. Another thing that a lot of times managers talked about was a frustration that those companies would take a percentage of the sales. They would actually ask for cheaper prices so that the end user customers didn't have to pay so much. And so I'm telling that story because I think it helps me explain these terms. Grounded theory method. What is grounded theory method? That is going into a study, and the textbook definition of it is going into a study with no assumptions at all, and then letting sort of these categories from the interview data emerge. And you don't actually go in with a categorization scheme in mind beforehand. So the story I told, we were just trying to find pain points or negative perceptions of these apps. That was the information we were trying to find out. We didn't know what categories were emerged, and those categories about taking the tips and presenting the food and the cuts from the sales, those were things that we didn't expect at all. They just emerged from the data. That's an inductive approach technically. That's why I have the word induction written down there, because we are going from all these specific cases, and we research, right, dozens and dozens, and talk to dozens of people, and we're taking all these specific cases and we're saying, well, there must be a general rule because we're seeing the same thing across all of these specific cases, rather than deductive, which might be, well, if we had, before we went into the study, we have an idea of how we think this works, and so if that were true, what should we see? And seeing whether we were correct or not, that would be a deductive approach. What is saturation? Saturation is how you know when you should stop collecting data. That is, saturation occurs when you stop hearing something new. You keep hearing the same stories over and over and over again. In our study with the restaurants, we were hearing the same thing over and over and over again. We stopped hearing anything interesting outside of those sort of like 4 categories of things I just mentioned to you earlier. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stop the study, but it certainly means you need to change your approach. You need to start talking to a different group of people if you want to continue your research, if you still haven't found out the answers to your questions, or you want to change the questions that you're asking. Something needs to change when you reach saturation if you hope to find out more data, or that means you know that your study is done. So in the next video, I'll briefly talk about academy versus industry. See you then.